Hi class. So for my cover photo, I decided to choose a picture of my niece. Her name is Dreama. She's actually my sister's niece, but she calls me Auntie Anna, and we've had a really strong connection ever since she was born. And so I spend a lot of time with her. I was her nanny for a couple years when she was younger, and I still see her multiple times a week every time I'm home. And so we just have a really strong connection, and she makes me super happy. So I thought I would talk about how I've seen some of these strategies in her life growing up, and how she's still developing some of them. So yeah, she's in this picture. She's at her preschool, which is it's like a highly parent involved preschool. So they have parents in the classroom every day. And I was able to go with her a couple days a week this past semester. And so I got to see her in her learning environment, which was really cool, and how she was able to use math in her everyday activities and make new friends. So yeah, it was really cool to see her in that learning environment. So yeah, I've seen Dreama practice a lot of these different strategies, but some that stood out to me that I can remember specific events was one of them was counting backwards. So when we were in her backyard one day, we were going down the slide, which we had always done, and every time she would sit on my lap and we would go down the slide. I would count down from three, so I'd go three, two, one, and then she would go. And she never really questioned it when she was younger. I don't know if she hadn't really developed those questions, or like if now that she's starting to understand numbers, she's understanding that I was going backwards. So a couple months ago, she asked me why I was counting in that order. She said, "Isn't it one, two, three?" And it was a great opportunity for me to kind of explain to her how I was counting backwards down from three instead of up from one, two, and three. And so it was kind of cool that she came upon that question herself and asked why I was counting that way. And because it was kind of showed me that she was formulating these own questions in her own head. Another example that Dreama has shown me is has to do with magnitude. And she's still trying to understand this concept. It's a little bit harder. She's only like 3.5. She's going to be turning 4 in a couple months. But so this concept is kind of hard for her to understand right now. But she definitely is starting to understand it, and we've practiced it a lot. And I kind of just tie it in whenever I can. But an example I can think of is when we like sit down for lunch and we have like our leftover like watering cups. I'll fill one of the cups. Mine is usually bigger than hers. I'll fill her cup up with water, and mine's empty, and then I'll pour her water into my cup. And we kind of just have a good conversation, and she asks a lot of good questions about which cup is, or which amount is bigger. And she used to always say that the bigger cup had less water. But the more I explain it to her and the more we practice it, she's finally starting to understand that it is the same amount of water. It's just the size of the cup that makes it look different. So that's kind of cool to see how she's starting to learn. And then she also uses both one-to-one correspondence and one-to-one tagging while counting. I've seen her do both pretty frequently. Every time she counts something, she does one or the other. And so I've noticed when there's not as many objects to count, she usually uses one-to-one correspondence and counts each one individually while touching them, but doesn't necessarily group them or move them at all. But when there's a lot more objects, she usually uses one-to-one tagging, and moves the objects around and kind of keeps track of which ones she's already counted. And then another thing that I've seen Druma do is subitizing. And so right now at her age, she's usually can see a group of objects of about three or four, and not have to count them and use one-to-one correspondence. But anything more than four, she usually uses one-to-one correspondence to count. And then, so in my own childhood, I was trying to think back of examples of the different strategies, and one that I could think of is conservation of quantity. And just like how Dreama was kind of confused on the magnitude, I was kind of confused on conservation of quantity when I was growing up. But yeah, once it clicked, I thought it was really fun to experiment with moving objects around. And once it clicked, I totally got it. And didn't even look back on how it was confusing. And then another example is unitizing. And one example I can think of is when I was little, I would collect bouncy balls from the little like dispensers at restaurants and stuff. And I started with just like a couple dozen, but eventually, like growing throughout my childhood, I had like hundreds. Like it was something I loved collecting. And so when I was little, when I only had a couple dozen, I would always categorize them into either different colors or different textures or stuff like that. And so I would unitize them into how they looked or felt. And then another example I can think of in my childhood is counting on. I remember, I don't know why I remember this so vividly, but I remember eating lunch one day and I sumatized that I had 5 chips. I just looked at them and I knew that there were 5 chips there. And then I remember reaching my hand into the chip bag and counting 6, 7, 8, 9. And so I had a total of 9, but I didn't have to count those 5 to begin with. I just used counting on to add to the 5 chips I already had. So yeah, those are some examples from my childhood and Dreama's childhood and her continuing growing up of all these math strategies.